non ti rimembra di quelle parole con le quali la tua etica pertratta le tre disposizioni che il ciel non vole.
Hi, I'm Brian E. Denton, author of the book A Year of War and Peace and the poetry collection Inspiration. Welcome to my channel. This video is part of a series I'm doing on Dante's Divine Comedy, wherein I'm reading through the entire epic poem at a rate of 3 cantos per week. Canto is essentially a chapter, if you want to think about it like that. And I'm doing this as an independent contribution to Baylor University's 100 Days of Dante Project. I think it's a fantastic project. I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I would suggest you go check it out. The links to the 100 Days of Dante Project are in the show notes below. If this is your first time visiting the channel, I'd first like to say welcome, and I hope that you find something that you enjoy in it. I'd also ask you to please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Now, last month, the month of September, we set the goal of getting to 150 subscribers, and I'm happy to report that indeed we did get there. At the time of this recording, we're at 152 subscribers. So I think it's time for us to get a new challenge. And that challenge is going to be to get up to 200 subscribers by the end of this month, October 2021. So with your help, I think that we can definitely get there. It's only 50 more subscribers, 48 technically, I guess. I'm really good at math. So thanks for that in advance. And also a quick note about the organization of these videos. There's going to be this introduction, which I'm doing now, and then a few other sections. There'll be a synopsis where I will just go over the plot of the canto. Then there'll be a characters and themes section where I will discuss the characters and the themes. And I'll conclude everything with a takeaway, wherein I offer my own personal thoughts on the canto. Then there'll be a quick outro with some discussion prompts for down in the comments. So with that, let's get right into it. Dante's Inferno, Canto 11. Our two heroes, Dante the Pilgrim and his guide Virgil, find themselves at the brink of a high bank looking down into a set of descending circles. The stench here is overwhelming, like the empty car in a subway train. So they draw back behind this slab of a tomb. This tomb is the eternal home of a pope, Pope Anastasius. And Pope Anastasius, this tomb says, was pulled from the right path by Photinus. As the two of them wait, Virgil launches into a very academic discussion where he details the taxonomy of hell. That is, how it's ordered and how it's organized. He tells Dante that below them there are 3 circles, each one smaller than the one that comes before. Each circle is filled with those who have been condemned to eternal damnation. Further, Virgil tells Dante that all evil deeds despised in heaven are born from injustice on earth. And injustice is when one harms someone, either through force or fraud. And fraud, given that it is practiced by mankind alone within the animal kingdom, is much more hateful to God, and therefore fraudsters are punished in the deepest regions of hell. The first circle below them is for the violent. And this circle of hell consists of 3 rings, Virgil says, because violence takes 3 forms. Violence against one's neighbors, violence against oneself, and violence against God. Then after this, there are the circles of force, where those poor souls are punished who committed fraud. This is the darkest region of hell. And Virgil then tells Dante the Pilgrim about the forms of fraud that are punished down there. This leads Dante to ask why those inhabitants of circles 2 through 5 are not punished within the city of Dis. Virgil responds that the sins of those that they've already met in circles 2 through 5 are less egregious in God's eyes, because their sins are sins of incontinence, whereas the sins of the city of Dis are the sins of willfulness. The sins of willfulness are the sins of malice and mad brutishness, and these are much worse than the sins that we encountered previous to Dis. And after this, Virgil talks a little bit about how art is the grandchild of God, which is really nice. He says that nature is the child of God, and art is the child of nature. Therefore, art is the grandchild of God. Nice. And with that, Virgil tells Dante that it's finally time to go. And they do, bringing this canto to a close. There's really not much to say about character or characters in this canto. Our heroes really don't do anything at all. They sit behind this slab of a tomb while Virgil discourses on the organization of hell. We do learn about this guy, Pope Anastasius, and Photinus, however you pronounce his name. Dante's got this horrible habit of introducing characters whose names I can't pronounce. But nevertheless, there's these 2 guys, and it appears that Photinus has led the good Pope into heretical thinking. Scholars are actually a little bit confused as to who this Pope is meant to be. and it appears that Dante himself was confused as well. Frankly, I don't see any reason to get into this controversy at all because in my opinion, it doesn't lend anything to the narrative. Could be wrong about that, just my own personal opinion. All you need to know is that this pope was led into heretical thinking by this guy Photinus. And that's it in terms of character. Not much. But there is a lot to talk about in terms of themes, so let's get right into it. For me, the most important thematic element of this canto is that once again, we're seeing Dante the Great Remixer at work. In fact, this canto may be the poet DJ remixer at his finest. He's really out there spinning something marvelous on the ones and twos. Beautiful Christian melodies over sick pagan beats. I say this because, as it should be clear, the Divine Comedy is a decidedly Christian poem. Yet this canto in particular draws heavily from the ancient pagan Greco-Roman world. In fact, Aristotle the Greek and Cicero the Roman reign supreme down here, at least thematically. Remember that they're actually back up there in limbo hanging out. We see this in the canto's discussion of ethics and physics and the issues of force and fraud. Let's start with force and fraud. The first discussion of force and fraud occurs over the course of 2 stanzas and lines 22 through 27. Here, Virgil the guide offers his overview of hell. And in it, he reports that all the evil deeds punished within the city of Dis come from the sin of injustice. And the sins of injustice are born from either force or fraud. And fraud, because it's practiced by man alone, is much more hateful to God than force. This is straight out of Cicero. Now you'll recall Cicero from up in Limbo or any Latin courses that you may have taken. I didn't take any because I went to public school in Florida, which is its own special ring of hell. Here's what Cicero had to say about force and fraud. It comes from his book On Duties, which is an absolute classic and you must read it. Wrong may be done in either of 2 ways, that is, by force or by fraud. Both are bestial. Fraud seems to belong to the cunning fox, force to the lion. Both are wholly unworthy of man. But fraud is the more contemptible. But of all the forms of injustice, none is more flagrant than that of the hypocrite, who at the very moment when he is most false, makes it his business to appear virtuous. Is this not exactly Virgil's argument in this canto? I mean, we have talk of injustice being born from either force or fraud, and that fraud is the more egregious of the 2. It's highly likely that Dante sampled this from Cicero, Dante the remixer. Now let's talk about ethics. And when we talk about ethics in Canto 11, the pagan sampling is explicit. Virgil explicitly references the Nicomachean ethics in lines 79 through 81. He talks here of the 3 dispositions that heaven opposes: incontinence, malice, and mad brutishness. The idea of incontinence comes straight out of Aristotle, and he describes incontinence as the state of things being out of control, that is, of things lacking self-restraint. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because the sins of incontinence are those sins that we encountered before we got to the city of Dis. The sins of lust, the sins of avarice, the sins of gluttony. These are the sins where the sinner loses control of his or her will. Contrary to the sins of incontinence are the sins of malice and mad brutishness, which we will see punished within the walls of the city of Dis. Here's what Aristotle says in his Nicomachean Ethics about incontinence and brutality. There are 3 forms of things to be avoided in morals: vice, incontinence, and brutality. Then continent man, knowing that things are bad, does them at the instigation of passion. But the continent man, knowing that the desires are bad, refuses to follow them in obedience to reason. Now, there's a lot of really good stuff on incontinence in the Nicomachean Ethics, and I suggest that everyone go out and read the book. In particular, there's a lot of good passages on how best to steel oneself against the sins of incontinence. And you definitely want to do this because if you can avoid the sins of incontinence and also malice and fraud and force, well, then you can avoid hell, which is good. Although it didn't work out for Aristotle, did it? Because he's down there in limbo. So the thing to understand about this canto is that Virgil's taxonomy of hell is heavily, if not wholly, sampled from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about Dante being the great remixer, spinning Christian themes over pagan tracks. I think this theme is perhaps strongest in this canto. What do you think? In addition to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Virgil also directly references another work by Aristotle, and that work is Aristotle's Physics. And here we find one of my favorite parts in this canto. This is where, according to Virgil, Aristotle's Physics shows that art is the grandchild of God, because God's child is nature, and nature's child is art. What this has to say about the role of realism in art is an entirely different conversation, maybe a conversation to have down in the comments below, but we just don't have time for it right now in this video. There are just 2 more quick points that I'd like to make before moving on to the takeaway section for this canto. The first is about the length of time, in terms of cantos, that we spend with the city of Dis as compared to the previous circles of hell 2 through 5, and then also a little bit about private property. Let's talk first about the length of time that we're spending with each individual sin. You'll recall from earlier parts in the poem that we didn't spend more than one canto typically discussing a certain type of sin. And in fact, in some cantos, maybe just one of them, we went through 2 circles and we discussed 2 sins within the space of just one canto. Now, however, we're just at the beginning to the city of Dis, and we've been here for more than a few cantos already. Further, moving forward, we're going to spend almost half of the entire poem just dealing with the sins of fraud found within the city of Dis. Seriously, we're going to be with the fraudsters from Canto 18 all the way until we leave hell in Canto 34. Of course, this makes sense given how reprehensible the sins of fraud are according to Dante the poet and Aristotle the philosopher. What do you think? Do you think that there are thematic elements in this poem related to the relative length that Dante the poet spends on each type of sin? That is he setting it up so the more length that he offers a type of sin, the graver he believes it to be? Finally, let's wrap up with a little talk about private property. Did you notice Dante's advocacy for private property rights in this canto? We see this, of course, in the stanzas dealing with violence in lines 31 through 51. Dante speaks out about theft and pillage of goods. Here it's implied that a person's private property is actually a part of one's own person, or at least close enough that private property should be afforded the protection of law. Indeed, Dante the poet's conception of property can be seen as a kind of proto-Lockean understanding of private property, wherein property emerges from one's toil. Just look to lines 103 through 108. Here we have Dante saying that people earn their goods through toil. This is similar to what John Locke himself would argue in his second treatise of government, also a highly recommended read. Now, one last note, and I just thought of this, so I don't even really know what I think about it. But what would you say to the proposition that perhaps we could look at Dante, the poet, Dante Alighieri himself, as a kind of medieval proto-liberal? And the reason I would suggest this is because we've seen in this canto that he has at least an implicit support for private property rights. But he's also an obvious multiculturalist and cosmopolitan, and we see this in his integration of the classical pagans into his poem. And also, he's got these Muslims up in limbo, and you would expect, or at least I would, for a medieval Christian to think that the Muslims were suffering all types of horrible things down in hell, which one of them actually is, and we'll learn that as we get there. But given all this, do you think that we could classify Dante as a proto-liberal? Now, obviously, I don't mean liberal in the American sense of being a leftist, but I mean a liberal in the sense of favoring liberty as the basis for political order. Obviously, no medieval thinker was a liberal. We didn't get the liberal revolution until much later in history. But do you think that we see the seeds of the liberal philosophy within this poem? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Canto 11 of Dante's Inferno may very well be the most ironic canto in the entire poem. And the reason I say this is because this canto concerns pretty much just 2 characters. You got Virgil and you got Dante. And Virgil assumes a role of teacher in this canto, and then Dante, of course, is the student. And Virgil just dryly lectures Dante on the taxonomy of hell, the organization of hell. And the reason I find this ironic is that if this canto teaches us anything, and this is today's takeaway, it's that academic learning is far inferior to experiential learning. That is to say that this canto teaches us that we learn more and at a much deeper level through direct experience rather than through books or mere words. This canto is all about academic learning. It's essentially a one-on-one introductory course to hell as taught by Virgil to a student Dante. In fact, in his lecture, Virgil makes use of traditional professorial resources, namely books. He teaches about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he teaches about Aristotle's Physics, and he teaches about, implicitly at least, Cicero's On Duties. Beyond that, Virgil offers his pupil Dante no real-life applications of the lessons taught. He merely lectures him. How efficacious is this lecture? Not so efficacious, it turns out. Look at Dante's responses. On more than one occasion in this canto, Dante responds that he doesn't quite understand what Virgil is trying to teach him. Dante, for instance, is first confused about the divisions of sinners into the different levels of hell. He asks, for instance, why some of the sinners suffer less in the previous circles that they've been to, whereas the sinners in the city of Dis are actually punished quite sternly. and this occurs in lines 67 through 75. Dante also expresses confusion over the issues of usury in lines 94 through 96. So we see that despite having a fantastic instructor, Virgil, Dante still fails to understand the lessons that Virgil is trying to impart to him. Contrast this with the previous cantos, where Dante has learned of the sins and their punishments firsthand. I'll use just one example to illustrate. Let's recall Canto 4 and Canto 5. In Canto 4, Dante the poet offers up some soaring praise for the practitioners of the art of poetry. Of course, he includes himself in this list, and you have to remember that up until this point, Dante has only been known for the Vita Nuova and other poems, mostly those of a romantic nature. Love poems, essentially. So he's basing his grand inclusion among the greatest poets of all times on the basis of his love poems, his lyric poems of courtly love. Finally, in so great esteem does Dante the poet hold poetry, in fact, that he has God dispense with a relatively mild punishment for all the pagan poets, as he places them in limbo rather than down in the city of Dis. So the bottom line is this. At this particular point in the poem, and I'm speaking here of Canto 4, remember, Dante the poet has a very high estimation of poetry in general and his poetry in particular. It's interesting to note then what happens in the following canto, Canto 5. Here, Dante the Pilgrim is introduced to those sinners who are being punished for the sins of lust. You'll surely remember those haunting images of those countless sinners swirling about uncontrollably in the great gale of lust. One of these poor souls speaks with Dante. This is Francesca. And Francesca tells her story of lust and how it was provoked by reading poetry. In fact, the type of poetry that Francesca was reading was exactly the type of poetry that Dante was producing. This was the lyric poetry, the poetry of courtly love. What happens when Dante experiences Francesca's punishment? What happens when Dante learns about how she came to be there? Well, he swoons. He's filled with a dreadful pity. This experience with Francesca teaches Dante the poet something. And what it teaches him is the true meaning of love, what comes to be known as Dante's theology of love. His new theology of love is vastly different from the type of love poems that he was writing before. In the lyric poetry of courtly love, love is presented as a compulsive force which sweeps one's reason away. And indeed, Dante's early poetry agrees with this, and it argues for this version of love. But here in Inferno, perhaps after Dante the poet's experiential learning in the second ring of hell with Francesca, Dante argues for a theology of love where love cannot be said to be true love unless it is practiced in accordance with reason and prudence. So we see that in this canto, experiential learning is much preferable to mere bookish or academic learning. I believe this because experiential learning provides not just intellectual learning, but also emotional learning. You learn at a gut level, just as Dante the Pilgrim does, though hopefully with less swooning. So I'll leave you all today with an apropos quote from one of my all-time favorite novels. And this novel was actually written by a giant Dante fan himself. That person, of course, is James Joyce, and the novel I'm talking about is the deadly hilarious and sublimely beautiful Ulysses. The scene from Ulysses that I'm going to talk about is a lot like the scene that we have in today's canto, in that it features two characters, one assuming the role of a student and one assuming the role of an instructor. In the Inferno, Virgil is the instructor and Dante is the student. In Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus, who is actually a teacher, is playing the role of student. And the role of instructor is played by Mr. Deasy, the headmaster to the school where Stephen works. These two characters meet and they talk about Stephen Dedalus's future. Mr. Deasy asks what Stephen wants to do with his life because it seems like the school is just too little for him, that he's meant for more. He doesn't see Stephen as a teacher at all. So Stephen kind of sarcastically says, well, maybe then I'll be a learner. And then, contrary to his rather comic and bumbling character, Mr. Deasy replies with something that's rather wise, and it's something that's always stuck with me, and that's why I want to share it with you, and it's related to the takeaway today. Mr. Deasy says, to learn, one must be humble, but life is the great teacher. All right, so that concludes my video on Canto 11 of Dante's Inferno. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. If you did like the video, please consider liking it on YouTube and subscribing to the channel. That would really help me out a lot. In fact, I'm trying to get up to 200 subscribers by the end of October. That's October 2021. And I think with your help, we can get there. We're at 152 right now. What's more important than liking the video and subscribing to the channel, though, is getting a conversation going down in the comments. That's what I'm here for. So to that end, what I've done is I've collected a few questions that can serve as, discussion prompts for everyone. And I'll list those now. Number 1, what do you think of the poem in general and this canto in particular? Number 2, what do you think of this idea of Dante as the great remixer? You know, his mixing of Christian themes and pagan literature. Number 3, do you think Dante the poet is hinting at anything by having the sins of dis take up way much more poetic real estate than the sins of incontinence? And finally, number 4, Dante the medieval proto-liberal, yay or nay? Remember that in addition to leaving comments down below, you can also contact me on Twitter at Brian E. Denton, and we're going to be releasing these videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So our next video is going to come out on Monday. Until then, take care of yourselves and others. Of course, this makes sense given how What is your opposition to English?